Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we are embarking on a massive 10,000-year journey across the largest landmass on Earth, Eurasia. We're going to dive into one of history's greatest human enterprises, the Silk Road, and uncover how some incredibly specific, surprising events along this route fundamentally shape the reality that you and I live in today.
But before we really get going, I want to throw a question at you. What truly built the modern world? You know, when we think about the forces that shaped our history, we usually picture great kings, hordes of gold, or brilliant generals commanding massive armies, right?
Well, what if I told you that's really not the whole story? Actually, scratch that, it's barely the beginning. What if the real architects of the modern era were incredibly bizarre, microscopic, or just seemingly mundane? Kings and gold played their part, for sure, but as we're going to see, history was actually steered by things like a sturgeon's fish bladder, an infected flea, and a simple, fast-growing weed.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap. First, we'll look at how the Silk Road was more than just trade. Then, weapons that forged empires, followed by the biological highway, the information revolution, and finally, the new Silk Road. Section 1. More than just trade. Shattering the silk and gold myth. We so often picture the Silk Road as just a dusty route for luxury fabrics and spices, but it was actually the ancient world's original World Wide Web. Just think about the year 53 BCE, at the Battle of Carrhae. The supposedly unstoppable Roman legions were facing the Parthians. We're talking 40,000 Romans against just 10,000 Parthians. It should have been an absolute slaughter, but instead Rome suffered one of its worst defeats ever. Why? Because the East was innovating. The Parthians deployed horse archers and what's known as a cataphract. Think of a cataphract as an ancient, heavily armored cavalryman that acted like a living battle tank. Eastern military technology was traveling west, and it was completely devastating.
Moving right along to Section 2, weapons that forged empires, from nomadic steppes to European knights.
So this ancient highway quickly became a massive conveyor belt for the absolute most terrifying weapons of the age. Take the incredible micro-story of how the recurved composite bow was born. To make this revolutionary weapon, you needed wood, horn, and sinew. But packing all that power into a really short bow meant it would literally pull itself apart under the tension. Well, some unknown genius out there discovered that if you take the swim bladder of a sturgeonfish from the Black Sea, break it up, and boil it down, you get this phenomenally strong viscous glue. That simple fish bladder glue was the technological breakthrough that unleashed the deadly horse archer onto the world.
Now, none of these innovations happened in a vacuum. The Silk Road allowed them to overlap. It's like a giant puzzle. You had mass-produced socketed arrowheads spreading from the east, recurved bows moving west, and military discipline coming down from the north. Eventually, an absolutely crucial Chinese innovation, the stirrup, traveled all the way across Asia to Europe. Stirrups allowed a rider to use a heavy lance without being knocked right off their horse. It's just amazing to think about how this combination of disparate Eastern technologies literally snapped together across continents to create the heavily armored European medieval knight and later on, the unstoppable Mongol armies.
And you know, sometimes the most world-changing events are just complete accidents. This brilliantly illustrates our point. Ancient Chinese alchemists were trying to mix sulfur and saltpeter to create an immortality potion for aristocrats. Instead, they blew up their workshops. They inadvertently invented gunpowder. The Mongols eventually weaponized this into fire lances and exploding bombs, bringing the technology west. By the Battle of Crécy in 1346, the English were actually using gunpowder cannons against the French. That explosive noise, which they described as God thundering, terrified soldiers and literally spelled the end of the era of the medieval knight. Which brings us to Section 3, the biological highway, seeds, parasites, and plagues.
So we've seen how weapons moved around, but honestly, the transit of living things had an even bigger impact on our world. Millennia before the official Silk Road was even a thing, farmers were swapping seeds. The West had long-season crops, like wheat and barley. The East had a highly mobile, short-season weed called broomcorn millet. When these crossed paths, farmers realized something incredible. They could plant the fast-growing millet right after harvesting their wheat. Suddenly, the exact same plot of land is producing 2 harvests a year. This massive calorie boost freed up huge parts of the population to stop farming and become craftspeople, priests, and elites. It essentially funded civilization.
But, okay, not everything hitchhiking on this biological highway was exactly beneficial. At an ancient relay station in western China, archaeologists excavated latrines and found 2,000-year-old refuse sticks, basically the ancient equivalent of toilet paper. When they analyzed the dried cloth on these sticks, they found the Chinese liver fluke.
Now, this is a parasite that strictly requires marshy, wet environments. Yet here it was, 1,500 kilometers away in a bone-dry desert. It proves definitively that invisible parasites and diseases were hitchhiking inside humans straight across the continents.
And that invisible transit leads us to a truly staggering number: 25 million. That is the low estimate of how many Europeans were wiped out by the Black Death between 1347 and 1356. We're talking 1/3 of Europe's entire population. This apocalyptic plague was brought over by infected fleas, hitching a ride on the rodents that traveled alongside armies and trade caravans coming from Central Asia.
But here's the wild part. The sheer horror of the Black Death inadvertently caused a massive butterfly effect. Because there were suddenly so few workers left alive, the nobility had to offer much higher wages just to get their fields farmed. Women entered the workforce in roles that were previously reserved only for men. It actually birthed the European middle class. And because manual labor was so incredibly scarce and expensive, it forced Europe to mechanize, leading directly to labor-saving inventions like the spinning wheel, horizontal looms, and blast furnaces. The tragedy literally forced the modernization of Europe.
All right, Section 4. The Information Revolution. The true power of paper.
As profound as all those physical and biological exchanges were, the absolute most powerful innovation to travel the road was arguably a medium for ideas. Just think about the timeline here. The ancient Chinese invented paper by pounding and boiling plant fibers. It actually started as a wrapping material and even toilet paper before becoming a writing surface. Buddhist monks brought it over to Central Asia, then the Arab world discovered it, and it became the administrative backbone of the massive Abbasid Caliphate, sparking the Islamic Golden Age. By the 900s, there were libraries in Muslim Spain holding tens of thousands of paper books, completely dwarfing European parchment libraries.
So, the crucial point is watching how this technology adapted when it hit Europe. China actually invented movable-type clay printing centuries earlier. But Chinese requires over 6,000 complex characters, which made printing incredibly tedious. When Johannes Gutenberg invented his metal movable type press in Germany in 1440, he had a massive geography advantage, the Latin alphabet. With just 26 simple letters, his press was lightning fast. Combined with cheap paper, it democratized knowledge overnight, sparking the Protestant Reformation and the Renaissance.
But then, we hit a massive turning point that changed everything. In 1453, the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople and effectively blocked Europeans from the Silk Road. Desperate for Asian spices, Christopher Columbus sailed west, accidentally triggering the Age of Discovery. And this led to massive global cross-pollination. New World crops like drought-resistant potatoes and corn traveled to China, sparking a huge population boom there. European Jesuits went to China to share science and map the world together, while Europe developed a raging, permanent addiction to Chinese porcelain and tea. And finally, Section 5, the new Silk Road, from canals to the cosmos.
So let's take a look at how these ancient Eastern tools literally physically carved out the infrastructure of the modern Western world. Take this micro story from 1824 over in the United States. Workers were digging the Erie Canal to connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, but they hit a massive solid wall of Lockport dolomite rock. Picks and shovels were completely useless. Without an ancient Chinese invention, gunpowder, the canal would have stopped dead in its tracks. But by blasting through the rock, they finished the canal. That specific waterway channeled the wealth of an entire continent directly into a single port, transforming New York City into the global megacity it is today. It just goes to show you the Silk Road is absolutely not ancient history. It is actively being rebuilt right now. Today, freight trains make the 12,000-kilometer journey from Yiwu, China to Western Europe in under 20 days. Through the trillion-dollar One Belt, One Road initiative, physical infrastructure is literally being laid across continents. And it's not just on Earth anymore. In 2017, China launched the Silk Road One CubeSat, which is the beginning of a whole satellite network to provide navigation across this massive new digital and physical corridor.
There's this quote from scholar Agnes Hu Tang that just sums the whole thing up beautifully. She notes, "The Silk Road was like a ray of light. It opened our eyes, east and west, to intangible ideas, to beautiful things, to beautiful thoughts. It wasn't just a simple exchange of goods, it was literally the demolition of physical and psychological boundaries between human beings." Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought. From horse archers and fish bladder glue, all the way to the plague, the printing press, and now to a trillion-dollar infrastructure network bridging continents, as the Silk Road expands from the Earth's surface into the cosmos with satellite networks, how will this ancient human enterprise